The afternoon sun blazed down on the crowded military base entrance as families and visitors streamed through the security checkpoint. Among them walked Sarah Chen, a petite woman in her early 30s, wearing simple civilian clothes, jeans, a navy blue blouse, and comfortable walking shoes. Her long black hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she carried only a small purse and her military identification card. To anyone watching, she looked like just another military spouse or family member visiting the base. There was nothing about her appearance that would immediately suggest she held one of the highest ranks in the United States Navy. Sarah had learned long ago that sometimes blending in was not just preferable but necessary. She had been away from active duty for 3 months, recovering from a classified mission that had taken her to some of the most dangerous places on Earth. The Navy had insisted she take time to decompress, to readjust to life outside the constant threat of enemy fire. But Sarah was ready to return to her duties, and today marked her official comeback to Naval Special Warfare Command. As she approached the main gate, Sarah noticed the usual hustle and bustle of military life. Young Marines in crisp uniforms directed traffic and checked identification. The sound of drill sergeants barking orders echoed from a nearby training facility. Helicopters thundered overhead, their rotors beating a familiar rhythm that made her heart quicken with anticipation. Sarah had grown up on military bases like this one. Her father had been a career Navy officer, and she had spent her childhood moving from base to base, always surrounded by the structured world of military life. Even as a young girl, she had known she wanted to follow in his footsteps. But she had wanted more than just to serve. She had wanted to serve at the highest level possible. The path to becoming a Navy SEAL was not one that many women had traveled. When Sarah first expressed interest in special operations, she was told repeatedly that it was not a realistic goal. The physical demands were too great, the culture too resistant to change. But Sarah had never been one to accept limitations that others tried to place on her. She had spent years preparing her body and mind for the challenge. Every morning before dawn, she ran miles along the beach near her childhood home. She lifted weights until her muscles screamed for mercy. She practiced swimming in conditions that would terrify most people, in freezing water, in storms, with heavy equipment strapped to her back. When the Navy finally opened SEAL training to women, Sarah was among the first to volunteer. The selection process was brutal. Of the 12 women who started the program with her, only 3 made it past the first month. By the end of the 6-month training program, Sarah was the only one left standing. Her instructors had pushed her harder than anyone else, testing not just her physical limits but her mental resolve. They wanted to see if she would break under pressure, if she would use her gender as an excuse when things got difficult. Sarah never gave them that satisfaction. When other candidates were doing 50 push-ups, she did 75. When they were required to carry a 100-pound pack for 10 miles, she volunteered to carry additional equipment for teammates who were struggling. The day she graduated from SEAL training was one of the proudest moments of her life. Her father, now a retired admiral, had tears in his eyes as he watched her receive her SEAL pin. Her mother, who had worried constantly throughout the training, finally allowed herself to smile with relief and pride. But graduation was just the beginning. Over the next 8 years, Sarah had served on some of the most dangerous and sensitive missions in Navy SEAL history. She had been deployed to Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and a dozen other countries whose names she could never publicly mention. She had rescued hostages, eliminated high-value targets, and gathered intelligence that had saved countless American lives. Her fellow SEALs had initially been skeptical of serving with a woman, but Sarah had earned their respect through her actions rather than her words. She never asked for special treatment, never complained about the conditions, and never failed to complete a mission. In the tight-knit community of naval special warfare, reputation was everything, and Sarah's reputation was unassailable. 3 years ago, she had been promoted to Master Chief Petty Officer making her one of the highest-ranking enlisted personnel in the Navy SEALs. It was a position that commanded instant respect from military personnel across all branches of service. Her opinions carried weight in Pentagon briefing rooms. Her recommendations could influence military policy at the highest levels. But today, walking onto this base in civilian clothes, none of that was visible. She looked like any other visitor, which was exactly how she preferred it when she was not on official business. As Sarah approached the security checkpoint, she noticed a commotion near the main entrance. A young Marine corporal, probably no more than 20 years old, was having what appeared to be a heated discussion with an older man in civilian clothes. The man was gesturing angrily, his face red with frustration. "I'm telling you, I have every right to be here," the man was shouting. "Do you know who I am? I'm a retired colonel. I've been coming to this base for 15 years. The Marine corporal, to his credit, remained calm and professional despite the verbal assault. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but I need to see proper identification. Base security protocols require everyone to show current ID regardless of their previous service." "This is ridiculous," the retired colonel continued. "In my day, we didn't have all this bureaucratic nonsense. A man's word meant something." Sarah watched the scene unfold with growing concern. She could see that the situation was escalating, and she knew from experience that these kinds of confrontations rarely ended well if they were allowed to continue. The young Marine was doing everything right, but the retired colonel was clearly not going to back down easily. Other visitors had begun to gather around, watching the argument with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Some were taking out their phones, ready to record what was happening. Sarah knew that the last thing the Marine Corps needed was a viral video of a confrontation at a base entrance. She was debating whether to intervene when she noticed another figure approaching the scene. It was a Marine sergeant, probably in his late 20s, with the confident swagger that came with a few years of military experience under his belt. Unlike the young corporal, this sergeant had the look of someone who had seen combat and was not easily intimidated. Sarah hoped the sergeant would help defuse the situation, but as she watched him approach, she could see from his body language that he was not coming to mediate. He was coming to escalate. "What seems to be the problem here?" the sergeant asked, his voice carrying a tone of authority that immediately changed the dynamic of the situation. The retired colonel turned his attention to the new arrival, clearly relieved to be dealing with someone who appeared to have more experience. "Finally, someone with some sense. This corporal is refusing to let me onto the base, even though I've explained that I'm a retired colonel." The sergeant looked at the corporal with obvious disapproval. "Is that true? You're hassling a retired colonel over paperwork?" "Sergeant, I was just following protocol," the corporal replied, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. "Base security requires current identification from all visitors." "Don't quote protocol to me," the sergeant snapped. "I know what protocol is, but I also know when to use common sense and show respect to our veterans." Sarah could see where this was heading, and she didn't like it. The sergeant was about to undermine the corporal's authority in front of a crowd of witnesses, which would be bad for morale and discipline. Worse, he was about to ignore base security protocols to avoid a confrontation with a difficult visitor. She decided it was time to step forward. As she approached the group, she could hear the sergeant continuing his lecture to the young corporal. "Listen, son," the sergeant was saying. "When a man tells you he's a retired colonel, you show him the respect he's earned. You don't hide behind some regulation manual like a scared recruit." "Actually," Sarah said quietly as she joined the conversation, "the corporal is absolutely right. Base security protocols apply to everyone, regardless of rank or previous service." The sergeant turned to look at her, and Sarah could see the immediate dismissal in his eyes. Here was another civilian, probably a military wife, trying to insert herself into military business that didn't concern her. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a military matter," the sergeant said, his tone condescending. "I'm sure you mean well, but you don't understand how things work around here." Sarah felt a familiar flash of anger, but she kept her expression neutral. She had dealt with this kind of attitude countless times throughout her career. Some people simply could not accept that a woman, especially one who didn't look particularly imposing, could have any authority in a military context. "I understand perfectly well how things work," Sarah replied calmly. "The corporal is doing his job correctly, and you're undermining base security by suggesting he should ignore established protocols." The sergeant's eyes narrowed, and Sarah could see his irritation growing. The retired colonel was watching the exchange with obvious amusement, clearly enjoying the fact that his original problem was being overshadowed by this new conflict. "Look, lady," the sergeant said, taking a step closer to Sarah, "I don't know who you think you are, but you need to mind your own business and let us handle military affairs." The crowd around them had grown larger, and Sarah could see people taking out their phones to record what was happening. She knew that this situation was about to get much worse if someone didn't take control of it quickly. "I'm simply suggesting that we all follow the rules," Sarah said, maintaining her calm tone despite the sergeant's increasingly aggressive posture. "The corporal is doing exactly what he should be doing, and I think you should support him rather than undermining his authority." That was apparently the last straw for the sergeant. His face flushed red with anger, and he took another step forward, now standing uncomfortably close to Sarah. "You know what your problem is?" he said, his voice rising. "You're another one of these civilians who thinks they know better than the people who actually serve this country. You have no idea what sacrifice means, what honor means, what it takes to earn the right to wear this uniform." Sarah could feel the tension in the crowd around them. This was exactly the kind of situation that could spiral out of control very quickly. She needed to find a way to de-escalate before someone did something they would regret. But before she could respond, the sergeant made a decision that changed everything. Whether it was the stress of the moment, his frustration with what he saw as civilian interference, or simply a moment of poor judgment, he reached out and gave Sarah a hard shove with both hands. The push was forceful enough to knock her back several steps, and she had to struggle to maintain her balance. The crowd around them gasped in shock. Even the retired colonel, who had been enjoying the confrontation, suddenly looked uncomfortable. The young corporal's eyes went wide with horror. He might not have known who Sarah was, but he knew that a Marine sergeant had just physically assaulted a civilian visitor on a military base. That was a career-ending mistake, regardless of the circumstances. Sarah steadied herself and looked at the sergeant, who was now standing with his hands still extended, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just done. The anger on his face was being replaced by a dawning realization that he had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the distant sound of military aircraft and the whispered conversations of the crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation. Everyone seemed to be waiting for Sarah's reaction, wondering how a civilian woman would respond to being physically assaulted by a Marine sergeant. What they didn't know was that Sarah Chen was not just any civilian woman. She was a decorated Navy SEAL Master Chief who had survived firefights in Afghanistan, hostage rescues in Somalia, and classified operations in places that didn't officially exist on any map. And she was about to remind everyone present exactly who they were dealing with. The silence that followed the sergeant's shove seemed to stretch on forever. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes watching her, waiting to see how she would react to being physically assaulted by a Marine. The sergeant himself looked stunned by his own actions, his hands still partially extended as if frozen in the moment of his mistake. Sarah took a slow, deep breath and straightened her shoulders. When she spoke, her voice was calm but carried an unmistakable edge of authority that cut through the tension like a knife. "Sergeant, I'm going to give you one opportunity to apologize and step back," she said quietly. After that, this situation becomes official. And I promise you that's not something you want to experience. The sergeant's face flushed even redder, but now it was with embarrassment rather than anger. Something in Sarah's tone had penetrated his rage, and he was beginning to realize that he might have made a serious error in judgment. But his pride wouldn't let him back down in front of so many witnesses. "Are you threatening me?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Because last time I checked, civilians don't get to threaten Marines on military bases." Sarah almost smiled at that. If only he knew how wrong he was about her being a civilian, but she decided to give him one more chance to salvage what was left of his career. "I'm not threatening anyone," she replied. "I'm simply explaining the consequences of your actions. You've just committed assault on federal property against someone you know nothing about. I suggest you take a moment to think about whether you really want to continue down this path." The crowd around them had grown significantly. Word was spreading throughout the base that there was some kind of confrontation at the main gate, and curious personnel were gathering to see what was happening. Sarah could see several officers in the distance, apparently alerted by their subordinates about the disturbance. The retired colonel who had started this entire mess was now standing off to the side looking deeply uncomfortable. What had begun as his attempt to assert his importance had evolved into something far more serious than he had intended. The young corporal was clearly terrified. He understood better than anyone that this situation was rapidly spiraling out of control, and he knew that when the dust settled, someone was going to face serious consequences. He was praying it wouldn't be him. "Look," the sergeant said, his voice slightly less aggressive but still defiant. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're on a Marine base now. We don't take kindly to civilians telling us how to do our jobs." "That's interesting," Sarah replied, reaching into her purse. "Because I'm actually very familiar with how things work on military bases." She pulled out her military identification card, but she held it in such a way that only she could see it. She wanted to give the sergeant one final opportunity to make the right choice before she revealed who she really was. "Sergeant, I'm going to show you something that will change the entire nature of this conversation," she said. "Before I do that, I want you to understand that once you see this, there's no going back. Your actions today will become part of an official record, and you'll have to live with the consequences of how you've chosen to behave." For the first time since the confrontation began, the sergeant looked genuinely uncertain. Something in Sarah's demeanor was getting through to him, making him realize that he might be in much deeper trouble than he had initially thought. "What are you talking about?" he asked, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried just moments before. Instead of answering immediately, Sarah turned to address the young corporal who had been doing his job correctly throughout this entire ordeal. "Corporal, you've handled this situation exactly as you should have," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Military protocols exist for good reasons, and following them is never wrong, regardless of who might be inconvenienced." The corporal nodded gratefully, clearly relieved to hear someone acknowledge that he had been doing the right thing. Then Sarah turned back to the sergeant, who was now looking increasingly nervous as he began to sense that this situation was not developing the way he had expected. "Sergeant, you asked me if I know how things work on a military base," Sarah said. "You suggested that I don't understand what sacrifice means, what honor means, what it takes to earn the right to wear a uniform." She paused for a moment, letting the weight of his own words settle in. "You assumed that because I'm a woman in civilian clothes, I must be just another military wife who doesn't understand military culture. You decided that my opinion didn't matter because I haven't served my country." The sergeant was beginning to look genuinely worried now. The crowd around them had grown even larger, and he was starting to realize that his actions were going to have witnesses, regardless of how this situation resolved. "Let me tell you something about sacrifice and honor," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "I've served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan. I've been in firefights where good people died protecting this country. I've carried wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. I've made decisions that saved American lives and decisions that will haunt me for the rest of my life." The sergeant's face had gone pale. He was beginning to understand that he had made a terrible miscalculation. "I've spent 8 years of my life in places where every day might be my last, doing jobs that most people can't even imagine, working with some of the bravest and most skilled warriors this country has ever produced." Sarah's voice carried the ring of absolute truth, and everyone listening could hear it. This was not someone making empty claims about military service. This was someone who had lived it. "So when you ask me if I understand what it means to earn the right to wear a uniform," Sarah said, holding up her military ID so that the sergeant could see it clearly, "the answer is yes. I understand it better than you can possibly imagine." The sergeant looked at the ID card, and Sarah could see his eyes widen as he processed what he was seeing. His face went from pale to completely white in the space of a few seconds. "Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, United States Navy SEALs," Sarah announced, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Several Marines in the crowd snapped to attention automatically upon hearing her rank and designation. The young corporal's mouth fell open in shock. Even the retired colonel looked stunned. But the sergeant's reaction was the most dramatic of all. The blood drained from his face completely, and Sarah could see his hands beginning to shake as the full magnitude of his mistake hit him. He had just physically assaulted a Navy SEAL Master Chief. Not only was that assault on a superior officer, it was assault on one of the most elite warriors in the entire United States military. "Oh, God," the sergeant whispered, so quietly that only Sarah could hear him. "Oh, my God, what have I done?" Sarah looked at him with something that might have been pity. She had seen this look before, on the faces of people who had just realized they had made a mistake that would change their lives forever. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "do you still think I don't understand how things work on a military base?" The sergeant couldn't speak. He stood frozen, staring at Sarah's military ID as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The crowd around them was buzzing with whispered conversations as word spread about who Sarah really was. Navy SEALs were legendary figures in military culture, and most of the Marines present had never actually met one in person. To discover that this quiet woman in civilian clothes was not only a SEAL but a Master Chief was shocking beyond belief. The young corporal had recovered from his initial surprise and was now standing even straighter, clearly honored to have been defending the same protocols that a Navy SEAL Master Chief had endorsed. The retired colonel, meanwhile, was looking at his own situation in a completely new light. His complaint about showing identification seemed petty and embarrassing now that he understood what had transpired. But all eyes remained focused on the sergeant, who was still standing in stunned silence. Everyone could see that he was processing the implications of what had just happened, and everyone could see the growing horror on his face as he began to understand the consequences he would face. Sarah watched him for a long moment, then made a decision that surprised everyone present. "Sergeant," she said, her voice still calm but carrying unmistakable authority, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. What happens next depends entirely on your actions in the next few minutes." The sergeant looked up at her, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time since he had learned who she was. "You made a serious mistake today," Sarah continued. "You allowed your emotions to override your training, your judgment, and your professionalism. You physically assaulted a superior officer based on assumptions about her background and qualifications." The sergeant nodded miserably, unable to deny any of it. "However," Sarah said, and the sergeant's head snapped up at the word, "I'm willing to consider this a learning experience rather than a career-ending incident under certain conditions." The relief on the sergeant's face was visible, but Sarah wasn't finished. "First, You will apologize to Corporal Martinez here for undermining his authority while he was correctly following base security protocols. You will do this publicly, in front of all these witnesses, and you will make it clear that he was right and you were wrong." The sergeant nodded quickly. "Yes, Master Chief. Absolutely. Second, you will apologize to me for your assumptions, your disrespect, and your physical assault. You will acknowledge that your actions were inexcusable regardless of who I turned out to be." "Yes, Master Chief." Third, you will write a detailed report about this incident and what you learned from it. That report will be shared with your commanding officer and used for training purposes to help other Marines avoid making similar mistakes. The sergeant was nodding eagerly now, grateful for any opportunity to avoid the full consequences of his actions. "And finally," Sarah said, her voice growing stern again, "you will never again make assumptions about someone's qualifications or background based on their appearance. You will treat every person you encounter with the respect and professionalism that the Marine Corps expects from its personnel." "Yes, Master Chief, I understand completely." Sarah nodded. "Good. Then let's start with those apologies." The sergeant turned immediately to the young corporal who was still standing at attention. "Corporal Martinez," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd, "I owe you an apology. You were absolutely right to follow base security protocols, and I was completely wrong to suggest otherwise. You handled this situation professionally and correctly, and I should have supported you instead of undermining your authority. I'm sorry." The corporal nodded, clearly moved by the public acknowledgement. "Thank you, Sergeant. Apology accepted." Then the sergeant turned back to Sarah. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Master Chief Chen," he said, "I cannot begin to express how sorry I am for my behavior today. I made assumptions about you based on your appearance that were completely wrong and completely inexcusable. I disrespected not only you, but the uniform you've earned the right to wear and the service you've given to our country. And I physically assaulted you based on those wrong assumptions. There is no excuse for any of it, and I am deeply, truly sorry." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "Apology accepted, Sergeant. See that you learn from this." The tension that had gripped the crowd began to ease as people realized the situation was being resolved without anyone's career being destroyed. There was a sense of relief mixed with admiration for how Sarah had handled the entire incident. But the story was far from over. As the crowd began to disperse and the immediate crisis passed, Sarah realized that someone else had been watching the entire confrontation from a distance. Someone whose presence would add yet another unexpected element to an already remarkable day. As the crowd began to disperse and the immediate tension of the confrontation faded, Sarah noticed a figure approaching from across the base courtyard. Even at a distance, there was something unmistakably commanding about the way this person moved. The confident stride, the perfect posture, the way other personnel automatically stepped aside to clear a path. As the figure drew closer, Sarah could see it was a Marine colonel, probably in his late 40s, with the bearing of someone who had seen significant combat. His uniform was immaculate, his ribbons and decorations impressive even by military standards. But what caught Sarah's attention most was the way he was looking at her, not with the curiosity of someone who had heard about the incident, but with the recognition of someone who knew exactly who she was. The sergeant who had just finished apologizing to Sarah noticed the approaching colonel and immediately snapped to attention. His face, which had just begun to regain some color, went pale again as he realized his troubles might not be over after all. "Master Chief Chen," the colonel said as he reached the group, his voice carrying the crisp authority of senior command. "I'm Colonel James Patterson, commanding officer of this base. I believe we have some things to discuss." Sarah came to attention and rendered a proper salute, which Colonel Patterson returned with precision. The formality of the exchange was not lost on the remaining crowd, and those who had started to leave stopped to watch this new development. "Colonel Patterson," Sarah replied. I apologize for the disturbance at your main gate, sir. The colonel's expression was unreadable as he looked from Sarah to the sergeant and then to the young corporal who was still standing rigidly at attention. Master Chief, he said, I've been briefed on the general outline of what happened here today. However, I'd like to hear the details directly from you before I decide how to proceed. Sarah nodded and gave a concise but complete account of the incident, from the retired colonel's initial complaint through the sergeant's physical assault and subsequent apology. She presented the facts without editorial comment, allowing Colonel Patterson to draw his own conclusions about the behavior of his Marines. When she finished, the colonel turned his attention to the sergeant, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. "Sergeant Williams," he said, his voice carrying a tone that made it clear he was not pleased. "Is Master Chief Chen's account accurate?" "Yes, sir," Sergeant Williams replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Completely accurate, sir." Colonel Patterson studied him for a long moment. "Sergeant, do you understand the seriousness of what you did here today?" "Yes, sir. I physically assaulted a superior officer based on incorrect assumptions about her background and qualifications. There is no excuse for my actions, sir." "That's correct, but it's actually worse than that." The colonel's voice grew harder. "You didn't just assault a superior officer. You assaulted one of the most decorated and respected warriors in the entire United States military. Master Chief Chen has served our country with distinction in some of the most dangerous operations we've conducted in the past decade." Sarah felt slightly uncomfortable being praised so publicly, but she remained silent and let Colonel Patterson continue. "Furthermore," the colonel said, "your actions reflected poorly not just on yourself, but on the entire Marine Corps. You allowed your prejudices and assumptions to override your training and your judgment. That kind of behavior has no place in today's military." The sergeant nodded miserably. "I understand, sir. I'm prepared to face whatever consequences you deem appropriate." Colonel Patterson looked at him for another long moment, then surprised everyone by turning back to Sarah. "Master Chief Chen," he said, "I understand that you've chosen to handle this matter informally rather than filing an official complaint. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "Sergeant Williams has apologized and demonstrated that he understands his mistakes. I believe this can serve as a learning experience rather than a career-ending incident." The colonel nodded slowly. "That's very generous of you, Master Chief. However, I have additional considerations as the commanding officer of this base." He turned back to Sergeant Williams. "Sergeant, while Master Chief Chen has shown remarkable grace in her handling of this situation, I cannot simply ignore what happened here today. Your actions will be documented in your personnel file. You will receive formal counseling about appropriate conduct, and you will attend sensitivity training regarding unconscious bias and assumptions." "Yes, sir. I understand." "Additionally," the colonel continued, "you will personally apologize to Master Chief Chen's commanding officer for the disrespect shown to one of his personnel, and you will spend the next month working with our base diversity and inclusion officer to develop training materials that will help other Marines avoid making similar mistakes." Sergeant Williams nodded eagerly, clearly relieved that his career was not ending, but understanding the seriousness of the consequences he would face. Then Colonel Patterson did something unexpected. He turned to the young corporal who had been standing quietly throughout this entire exchange. "Corporal Martinez," he said, and the young Marine's eyes widened in surprise at being addressed directly by the base commander. "Yes, sir. You handled this entire situation exactly as you should have. You followed base security protocols correctly, you remained professional under pressure, and you didn't allow yourself to be intimidated into compromising security procedures. That kind of integrity and professionalism is exactly what the Marine Corps needs from its personnel." The corporal's chest swelled with pride. "Thank you, sir." "In fact," Colonel Patterson continued, "your performance today demonstrates the kind of leadership potential we're looking for. I'm recommending you for promotion to Lance Corporal, and I want you to report to my office tomorrow morning to discuss additional opportunities for advancement." The crowd around them murmured with approval. It was clear that Colonel Patterson was using this incident not just to address the sergeant's misconduct, but to reinforce the message that following proper procedures and maintaining professional standards was valued and rewarded. But Colonel Patterson wasn't finished. He turned back to Sarah with an expression that she couldn't quite read. "Master Chief Chen," he said, "there's something else we need to discuss. The reason I was able to respond to this incident so quickly is because I was already looking for you." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Sir?" "I received a call this morning from Admiral Morrison at Naval Special Warfare Command. He wanted to confirm that you had arrived safely and to let me know that you would be conducting some training exercises with my Marines over the next several weeks." Now it was Sarah's turn to look surprised. She had known that her return to duty would involve some cross-training with other branches of the military, but she hadn't expected to be working with Marines at this particular base. "I wasn't aware of any scheduled training exercises, sir," she said. Colonel Patterson smiled for the first time since he had arrived. "That's because they weren't scheduled until this morning. Admiral Morrison was impressed by some intelligence reports from your recent operations, and he wants you to share some of your expertise with our special operations personnel." He paused for a moment, looking around at the crowd that was still gathered nearby. "However," he continued, "given what happened here today, I think there might be an additional training opportunity that would benefit all of our personnel." Sarah had a feeling she knew where this was going, and she wasn't entirely sure she liked it. "Master Chief," Colonel Patterson said, "how would you feel about conducting a seminar on unconscious bias and assumptions in military settings? I think today's incident illustrates perfectly why this kind of training is necessary." Sarah considered the request carefully. On one hand, she had never particularly enjoyed being the center of attention or being held up as an example. On the other hand, she recognized that what had happened today was not an isolated incident. Throughout her career, she had encountered countless examples of people making assumptions about her capabilities based on her appearance. "Sir," she said finally, "I'd be willing to participate in that kind of training, but I think it would be more effective if it included perspectives from other personnel as well. This isn't just about my experience as a woman in special operations. It's about the broader issue of how assumptions and prejudices can compromise military effectiveness." Colonel Patterson nodded approvingly. "Excellent point, Master Chief. I'll have my staff work with you to develop a comprehensive program." As the formal discussion concluded, the crowd began to disperse for real this time. The excitement was over, and people needed to get back to their duties. But Sarah noticed that many of the Marines who passed by made a point of nodding respectfully or offering a quiet word of thanks for how she had handled the situation. The retired colonel who had started the whole incident approached her as she was preparing to leave. "Master Chief," he said, looking somewhat embarrassed, "I want to apologize for my part in causing this trouble today. I should have just shown my identification instead of making a fuss about it." Sarah smiled at him. "No harm done, Colonel. We all get frustrated with bureaucracy sometimes. The important thing is that everyone learned something from the experience." As the retired colonel walked away, Sergeant Williams approached her one more time. "Master Chief," he said, his voice still heavy with shame, "I know I already apologized, but I want you to know that I'm going to spend every day for the rest of my career trying to make up for what I did today." Sarah studied his face and could see that he was sincere. "Sergeant, the best way to make up for this is to learn from it and help others learn from it too. Use this experience to become a better Marine and a better leader." "I will, Master Chief, I promise." As Sergeant Williams walked away, Sarah was left alone with Colonel Patterson and Corporal Martinez. "Corporal," the colonel said, "you're dismissed. Don't forget to report to my office tomorrow morning." Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. The corporal saluted and headed back to his post with a spring in his step. Colonel Patterson turned to Sarah. Master Chief, I have to say I'm impressed by how you handled that entire situation. You could have destroyed that sergeant's career with a single phone call, but instead you chose to use the incident as a teaching moment. Sarah shrugged. We've all made mistakes, sir. The important thing is learning from them. Still, the colonel said, not everyone would have shown that kind of restraint and wisdom. Your reputation for leadership is well-deserved. As they walked toward the base headquarters building, Colonel Patterson continued the conversation. Master Chief, can I ask you something? In your experience, how common are the kinds of assumptions that Sergeant Williams made today? Sarah considered the question carefully. More common than any of us would like to admit, sir. I've been dealing with assumptions about my capabilities for my entire career. Sometimes it's overt, like what happened today. More often, it's subtle. People giving me easier assignments, excluding me from certain conversations, or assuming I need help with things I can handle perfectly well on my own. And how do you typically deal with it? It depends on the situation, Sarah replied. Sometimes the best approach is to simply prove people wrong through your actions. Sometimes you have to address it directly, and sometimes, like today, you get an opportunity to turn it into a learning experience for everyone involved. They had reached the headquarters building, and Colonel Patterson stopped at the entrance. Master Chief, he said, I want you to know that you're welcome on this base anytime. If you ever need anything, resources, support, or just a place to conduct training, my door is always open. Sarah smiled. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. As Colonel Patterson headed into the building, Sarah stood for a moment in the warm afternoon sun, reflecting on everything that had happened. When she had walked onto this base a few hours ago, she had been just another visitor in civilian clothes. Now she was leaving as someone who had made a real impact on the lives of several Marines and potentially influenced how this entire base would approach issues of bias and assumption. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Admiral Morrison. Heard about your impromptu training exercise today. Well handled. Looking forward to your report. Sarah smiled as she typed her reply. Sometimes the best training opportunities are the ones you don't plan for. As she walked back toward the base entrance, Sarah noticed that Corporal Martinez was back at his post, checking IDs and directing visitors with renewed confidence. When he saw her approaching, he snapped to attention. Master Chief, he said, it's been an honor, ma'am. The honor was mine, Corporal, Sarah replied. Keep up the excellent work. As she walked through the gate and off the base, Sarah reflected on the day's events. She had come here expecting a routine return to duty, but instead she had been reminded of why her service mattered. Not just the high-profile missions and classified operations, but moments like this when she could make a difference in how people thought about leadership, respect, and assumptions. The afternoon sun was beginning to set as Sarah got into her car and drove away from the base. Tomorrow, she would return in uniform to begin her official duties. But today had already proven that some of the most important work happened when you least expected it, and that true leadership was as much about how you treated people as it was about the rank on your collar or the ribbons on your chest. In the rearview mirror, she could see the base growing smaller in the distance, but she knew that the impact of what had happened there today would continue long after she was gone. Sergeant Williams would remember this lesson for the rest of his career. Corporal Martinez would carry the confidence he had gained into his new role as a leader. And somewhere, other Marines would receive training that might prevent them from making similar assumptions in the future. As Sarah drove into the evening, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was why she had chosen to serve, not for the recognition or the respect that came with her rank, but for moments like these when she could make a real difference in the lives of her fellow service members and in the culture of the military she loved.